Let's put things in basic perspective, which you're not going to find anywhere else. Not on talk radio, not on cable TV, and I don't care whose show it is. I want to put things in plain perspective. Joe Biden and his family have been involved in bribery, extortion, money laundering, wire fraud, involving enemies of the country. Communist China, the prior Ukrainian corrupt administration tied with Putin, and a corrupt Romanian government. They have acquired and have laundered and have secreted through shell companies anywhere from $30 to $50 million. Now that is enough to impeach this man, certainly with an inquiry, and enough for a special counsel. He's not even under investigation, let alone facing any kind of charges in any court in the land. Not a single charge. He took classified documents out of the Senate SCIF when he was a senator. It's a crime. A senator. And he took classified documents to his home in Wilmington and put them in the garage, which, if what Donald Trump did is a crime, is certainly a crime. Again, it's not protected by the Presidential Records Act. It's called the Presidential Records Act. Nothing. A phony special counsel appointed. The most milquetoast of milquetoasts that they could find. Donald Trump took documents to Mar-a-Lago as an ex-president under the Presidential Records Act. And under federal court precedent in Washington, D.C., Judge Jackson, an Obama appointee, he had every right not only to take them, but to decide what, if anything, he would give to the government. The National Archives, run by leftists, contacted the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland and said, we want those classified documents. Department of Justice was required to contact the White House for permission to look at the request. The White House gave permission. And they opened a criminal investigation. Because Donald Trump and his lawyers didn't act fast enough to give them what they wanted. Regardless of whether or not Donald Trump had to give them anything. And it also raises a much more complex constitutional issue of declassification. These are not things you indict a former president over, certainly not a candidate who's running for re-election. And yet Donald Trump was indicted under the Espionage Act of 1917. The Presidential Records Act, which went into effect in 1991, the Presidential Records Act wasn't even mentioned in the various charges that were brought against Donald Trump, even though it's the controlling law. And you have legal analysts all over TV telling you that this is the real case. And in bringing this case against Donald Trump, the prosecutors, the Biden Department of Justice, purposely used a Washington, D.C. grand jury, even though that violated official Department of Justice prosecutorial guidelines, which compels grand jury investigations to be done in the district in which the events, or most of the events, are alleged to have occurred. South Florida is 1,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. And so you have abuse of that process intentionally, given the makeup of the grand jury, made up of Democrats. All you need a majority of the grand jurors to agree to indict. Doesn't have to be unanimous. All the investigative activity, the witnesses, The presentations were made in Washington, D.C. to that grand jury. Then they ship them down to South Florida and say, okay, rubber stamp this grand jury in Florida. They rubber stamp it. And according to the Garland-Biden Justice Department, that's good enough. Even though they violated their own rules. They took 3 years' worth of video. They only wanted to give the president a certain number of weeks, if not months, of video. The judge down there said, that's ridiculous. You don't get to decide what video they see and they don't see. They wanted to try the case without President Trump and his lawyers actually seeing classified information. The judge said, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that either. They wanted to try the case in December, where a handful of Trump lawyers would have to go through 1.1 million documents, 3 years of videos, all the testimony and all the rest that took place in the federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. The Department of Justice insisted that Donald Trump could get a fair trial. And at stake is Donald Trump's freedom. Because if he's found guilty of all the charges that have been presented against him in the documents case, over documents, he would have to serve hundreds of years in federal prison. In other words, he would die in federal prison. Over documents. Then in Washington, D.C., again, we have another grand jury under the same prosecutors. Most of these people at the senior level work for Eric Holder at the Department of Justice. They worked with James Comey. They worked with Andrew Weissman. There's nothing special about this special counsel operation other than he was appointed special counsel, which means his entire existence is aimed at Donald Trump, as opposed to the usual criminal division activity, which is exactly why Garland will not appoint a special counsel to investigate Joe Biden, because they know Joe Biden will die in federal prison. Yes, they can hold the indictments till after he leaves the presidency. Then we come to Washington, D.C. January 6th, we're told, was an insurrection. January 6th commission put together by Nancy Pelosi, where she chose the Democrats and the Republicans, two never-Trumpers. They hold a Stalinist-like public show trial. No information is provided, no witnesses are provided in defense of Donald Trump. Nothing. No evidence is provided linking Donald Trump to any of the violence that took place on that day. None. Well, what they do is they try by implication. So Donald Trump was guilty of what happened that day because he spoke. Because he spoke to a group of people who assembled to protest the election. He specifically told them to be peaceful. 2 days before, he specifically told his acting Secretary of Defense, the head of the Joint Chiefs, the Chief of Staff to the acting Secretary of Defense, and others who were in the Oval Office, to inform Capitol Hill, meaning Pelosi, and the mayor of Washington, that he will make available to them 10,000 armed troops, National Guardsmen in the Army, if they're concerned or they think they need security. They said no, the optics would be bad. The same time, the director of the FBI, effectively Chris Christie appointee, because Chris Christie recommended him, former head of the criminal division under George W. Bush, Ray had on his desk a memo. The NYPD, the FBI office, one of their offices in Virginia, had picked up word that there could be violence that day. They sent it to headquarters and FBI, and nothing happened. It sat there. It sat there. Nothing happened. So Donald Trump, we were told, was responsible for whatever happened. And Donald Trump, we're told, was trying to obstruct the election of 2020. And Donald Trump, we're told, was trying to prevent the peaceful transition of power. And so what did they do? They take the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act as one of their charges against Donald Trump, having taken the 1917 Espionage Act against Donald Trump in the documents case. Then on the obstruction issue, they've been very successful charging protesters from January 6th with 18 U.S.C. Section 1512. What's that? Everybody scratched their head. What the hell's that? Well, after the Enron scandal was over, they felt there was a gap, and Congress was asked to pass a law, which they did, that would make it a felony for corporate executives to destroy records in anticipation of Congress holding hearings. They've taken that law, they've expanded it beyond recognition, and they've applied it to hundreds of January 6 protesters. This is the obstruction that they've charged them with. It's been appealed to the Circuit Court. It will eventually get to the Supreme Court, but not in time. And I must tell you, I'm very concerned when we watch John Roberts and his student, Justice Barrett, who are now repeatedly siding with the leftists on the court, as they did today. Barrett is a massive disappointment. Conservatives fought like hell for her. Too bad. She's an Anthony Kennedy. A disaster. That for another day. You're allowed to tell your vice president that you think he should send these decisions about electors back to the state. It's not illegal. It's not unconstitutional. It's certainly not criminal. That's not obstruction. You're allowed to reach back to state legislatures and the Republican Party and suggest that they send a list of their own electors. It's been done repeatedly. You hear the bobbleheads on TV regurgitate what I said, which is 1876 and 1960. That's exactly what was done. Today they call them fake electors. They can call them whatever they want. It doesn't change a damn thing. That's not a crime. The fact is that they were not certified by the archivist, and they were not accepted by the vice president serving as the president of the Senate, overseeing the January 6th ballot electoral counts. That's the way it's supposed to work. There's nothing criminal about it. Nothing. And so they charge him with these phony crimes, which he can do God knows how much more, another 200 years, I guess. And the judge that's overseeing the case is known to be a hack. She donated money to the Obama campaign. 2 years later, he appoints her to the court. She is a radical leftist. She abuses her authority. You had 3 federal judges from that court, all appointed by Obama, sitting in the back row last week when Donald Trump faced the magistrate at the public hearing. What do they think? Is this a clown show? Why were they sitting in the back row? And she's working very hard right now to write an opinion, in my view, which gives the federal government all or at least a big chunk of what they want, and putting a gag rule on the former president so he cannot run for president. This provides a massive opportunity for the president